Friday the 13th, The Jason Strain, Chapter 21. Alex had never felt so small in her life. The woman who seemed to be in charge had shown Alex how to fill the vest up with air like a life preserver, and all 6 of them floated in a tight cluster in the middle of the vast wide ocean. Alex was horribly aware of the huge amount of space below them. What was it, 20, 40, 80 feet down? And it was not empty space beneath her dangling legs. It was a living ocean, every square foot packed with hungry critters of all sizes, all sizing up the tasty meat of her thick, juicy calves. They seemed to have lost the infected soldiers, though. Who knew if there were more clustered down on the seafloor beneath them? Could they swim or bumble along the bottom? Alex guessed they would find out soon enough, once they went under. Under. That normal, totally unremarkable word took on a most sinister resonance in light of what they were about to do. Alex was glad she was not the only one who had never done this before. Of course, Val knew how, since she apparently knew how to do fucking everything, but Butch had never done this either, and she could tell that he was as scared as she was. For some strange reason, that made her feel better about the whole thing. She struggled to absorb every detail as the woman explained how the complicated equipment worked. Which number showed how deep you were, and what dial showed how much air you had left, how to pinch your nose through the mask and pop your ears, like on an airplane. It was all so much to take in, with so much riding on it, that Alex could barely breathe up on the surface. She did not know how she would survive. She only knew she had no choice. "Okay," the woman said. "First of all, always keep me in your line of sight. Things might get crazy down there, but if you get too far away from the scrambler, well, you know." Alex shuddered. "You won't be able to talk or call out if you're in trouble, so here are the hand signals I want you to use. This one's obvious." She made the OK sign with her fingers. "If one of us wants to know how you are doing, we're going to make this sign. And if you're okay, you're going to make it back. Get it?" Alex and Butch nodded. Val rolled her eyes like the bad, rebellious girl in the back of the high school classroom. "If you're not okay," Stella continued, ignoring Val, "I want you to do this." She made a seesawing motion with her hand, like when you say something is only so-so. "Got it? And if you're running out of air..." She made a throat-cutting motion across her neck that made Alex feel a little sick. They weren't going to need that signal, were they? The thought of running out of air 80 feet underwater made her throat tight and her palms sweaty. "And if you're in really serious trouble, do this." She raised her hand above her head and waved her arm from side to side. Serious trouble, Alex thought? More serious than running out of air? Maybe this whole diving thing wasn't such a good idea. "I want each of you to buddy with one of us," the woman said. "Names?" The way she said it, so sudden and terse like that, Alex almost didn't understand that she was asking their names, until Butch said his out loud. "I'm Alex," Alex replied. "That's Val." Val was floating back slightly, looking sullen. She nodded when Alex said her name. "Right," the woman said. "That's Tig and Larry." She pointed to her 2 remaining men. Tig was thin and intense, black but light-skinned. Larry was beefier and white, with thinning blonde hair and a lantern jaw. "And I'm Stella." The absurdity of this formal introduction struck Alex as preposterously funny, and she had to suppress a giggle. "I want Butch with Tig, Alex with Larry." Stella turned to Val. "And Val, you're with me." "No way," Val said. "I'm with Larry." Stella frowned. "I'm the leader of this outfit, and I don't have time to babysit. I want Larry with one of the tadpoles. You don't need him." "Fuck you," Val said. "I'm with Larry, or I'm alone. You ain't my leader." "For Christ's sake, Val," Butch said. "This is no time for your racist bullshit." "Fine," Stella said. "We don't have time to argue, so I guess I'm with Alex. I don't want to be responsible for your dumb white ass anyway." "What about my dumb white ass?" Alex asked. Something about the dire seriousness of the situation had short-circuited Alex's funny bone, and she was no longer able to keep from laughing out loud. There was a good chance that some, if not all of them, were going to die before they made it to the boat. But Alex had almost died too many times in the last 24 hours to do anything but laugh. Stella smiled, and Butch snickered, and even the other two divers were chuckling softly. Only Val remained serious. "Cut the comedy," Val said. "Let's do this if we're fucking doing it." "All right," Stella said. "Here's the plan. We go down here and come up on the other side of those military ships." She pointed out to the floating gray armada surrounding the island. "Newbies, we don't have time to teach you what's safe and what isn't, so don't touch anything. Try not to bump into any corals and stay away from the holes or caves. The bottom here is pretty uniform at 30 feet until after the ships, and then there's a hell of a shelf where it drops off to 150. I want everyone staying at 30 all the way, which means about 200 yards of mid-water for the last neck of the dive. Newbies, stay close, and I mean touching close. It's easy to get disoriented in mid-water, understand? And remember, mid-water is where the big cruisers hunt. I'm talking hammerheads, kids, so keep your eyes open. Stay aware and stay cool. They often travel in schools, so if you see one, chances are he brought 20 of his friends." Alex felt a cold coil of fear in her guts. Hammerhead sharks? Jesus! And remember, the more scared you get, the quicker you're going to use up your air. So staying cool isn't to impress the ladies, it's a matter of life and death. There's about a ton more really critical shit that you need to know, but frankly, we are out of time, so stay cool and stay close. Stella put a hand on Alex's shoulder. "You remember how to clear the water out of your mask, like I showed you?" Alex nodded, heart pounding. She turned to Butch, but he was over by Tig, his back to her. She was appalled by how badly she wanted to stay near Butch. She clenched her jaw. "Yeah," Alex said. "I'm ready." Stella nodded. "Okay then, let's go down." After the slow, strange drop to the bottom, letting air out of her vest a little at a time and pinching her nose to blow out the pressure in her head, Alex hovered above the fantastical, impossible landscape of a billion surreal and glorious corals, some big as trees, some low and humpbacked, each one more amazing than the last. Tiny jewel-colored fish swam fearlessly up to her mast, like curious fairies. It was so breathtakingly beautiful that Alex almost forgot why they were here. She could have spent the whole dive floating in that one spot, mesmerized. All her fears seemed to have bubbled up out of her like the shimmering silver bubbles from her mouthpiece. She was starting to drift after a big showy fish the size of a dinner plate when she felt a firm grip on her wrist. It was Stella, her eyes wide beneath her mask, but it was hard to read her expression with her lips pouted out around that regulator. She pointed at Alex and made the OK sign. Alex made the same sign back. Stella nodded and touched Alex's chest, and then her own, and pointed to the right. Stella hadn't mentioned this signal, but Alex assumed she meant the two of them should go that way. She turned to follow Stella and started swimming. Alex had a hard time trying to make herself buoyant enough not to scrape her belly on the stinging corals on the sea floor, but not so much so that she started to drift upwards. She didn't want to waste air puffing up and deflating her vest over and over, so she decided to concentrate on swimming. Her strong legs pushed her easily through the water, and she had no trouble keeping up with Stella. She could see Butch and Tig a little to the left, but didn't see Val and Larry. She figured they must be close behind. She was trying to look everywhere at once when a sleek gray shape appeared out of the blue haze. Alex felt a chilly flush of fear in her gut and clenched her fists, eyes wide as she came to a slow stop in the water. It was a shark, about her size with a skinny snout and flashy white tips on its fins. It circled once around their group, and Alex found herself gripping Stella's arm like a child at a horror movie. Stella tapped Alex hard in the chest and gave her the OK sign. Alex got the feeling that she was not asking if Alex was okay. She was telling Alex to be okay. Alex tried to slow her breathing and return the OK sign, even though she did not feel even remotely okay. She had lost sight of the shark, but then saw it again on her far right. To her tremendous relief, it turned away with the flick of its muscular tail and took off. Alex let out a long, slow breath and let her fist open. With the fear gone, she suddenly realized that she was getting awfully cold. There was a deep, penetrating chill in the water that seeped into her bones as she swam. But then Stella held up her fist and everyone stopped, and Alex forgot all about the cold. Stella was pointing ahead of them, where a natural dip in the ocean floor formed something like an irregularly shaped amphitheater. Above was the huge gray belly of a military ship. The area beneath the ship was littered with bodies. Most of them were still moving, some better than others. None of them really seemed to be able to swim, so they mostly flailed around on the bottom, stirring up the silt. As they watched, several more bodies came drifting down, twitching and shuddering as they spiraled toward the bottom. Most wore what was left of military gear, heavy belts, boots, and helmets that dragged them down as their Kevlar filled up with brine. The squirming bodies were strewn almost as far as the eye could see in both directions, like some nightmare landscape of hell in an old painting. Stella pointed up with one finger and then flashed the palm of her right hand, closed it to a fist, and flashed them again. Alex had no idea what she meant, but the other two divers seemed to get it because they nodded, each grabbing their respective charge. Stella grabbed Alex and pointed up again, then made the OK sign. Alex got it, but didn't understand why Stella wanted to go up when there was a ship full of infected soldiers above them. But you can't argue underwater, so she returned the OK sign and filled her vest with a few puffs of air, following Stella as she rose. They had only ascended about 10 feet when Stella stopped them. They all hung there for a minute while everyone was accounted for. Stella then signaled them to swim forward into the thick of the infected soldiers. Alex thought she was fucking nuts, but she saw that as the bottom dipped down beneath them, the infected men on the seafloor could not seem to figure out how to swim up to reach them. They reached impotently upward, bumping into each other and turning around and around in the murky silt. The 6 of them were almost halfway across, and Alex was sure they were going to fly right over the heads and hands of the infected soldiers, when a massive explosion resonated through the water, pushing them down dangerously close to the reaching hands. Luckily, the same blast also flattened the infected soldiers down into the muck on the bottom. Alex looked up with horror as orange bursts of flame and silver bubbles bloomed from the bottom of the ship, and the front of the vessel began to sag. Dozens of more bodies dropped into the water above them, raining down all around them. A young woman in camouflage fatigues made a swipe at Alex, gripping one of her flippers. Alex shook her foot to kick the woman loose. The woman's face was hideous, lips torn away from the teeth and eyes bulging. Her blonde hair was held back in a French braid that had come partially undone, freeing seaweed like tendrils all around the bloody rictus on her face. Alex kicked her way, and the woman spun in dreamy slow motion, down, 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 and to the left, out of reach. The ship above them was sinking, more than halfway under, and they were going to have to make a hard detour to the right, or it was coming down right on top of them. They swam as fast as they could. Alex was trying not to look back, but she could not help herself. She was caught up in the mesmerizing horror of the falling bodies, still animated horribly as they drifted down, and of the sinking bulk of the ship, still flaming in parts even underwater. It slid past 10 feet behind them, crushing hundreds of squirming infected soldiers beneath its massive weight as it hit the bottom. The sudden muscular gush of the displaced water pushed them forward at an alarming rate. Alex was completely disoriented and turned around. She had no idea which way they were headed, but she followed Stella like a dog, unwilling to let her guardian out of her sight even for a moment. Alex saw Val coming up quick on the left until she was nearly beside her, when out of nowhere a falling soldier body-slammed Val from above, driving her downward toward the reaching hands. Alex saw Val falling and kicking, and had a sudden uncharitable vision of Val running away with the handcuff keys. It would be suicide to go down after her. She wouldn't have done it for them. They ought to let the bitch die. Then, to Alex's surprise, Stella drew a spear gun from her shoulder and swam down after Val without a second of hesitation. Larry followed and beckoned that they should too. At first, Alex refused to go down in that nightmare melee, but then she remembered that Stella had the scrambler that kept Alex's head from exploding. She cursed into her regulator, but it came out as more bubbles. Butch and Tig were close by, and Tig flashed the OK symbol. Butch okayed back, and because she didn't appear to have a choice, Alex signaled that she was okay too. Together, the 3 of them went down after Val. Chapter 22. Marty and Sarah Dixon had been married 6 days, 17 hours, and 32 minutes. Needless to say, they could not keep their hands off of each other. They had met online 6 months ago and fallen head over heels in love instantly, as if simply resuming a conversation that had been interrupted by some minor annoyance. They were already finishing each other's sentences by the end of the first night they spent together. He was a web designer and she was an artist moonlighting as a barista in a trendy coffee shop. He was tall and skinny with clunky glasses and a sweet, bashful smile. She was short and curvy with curly red hair chopped into a sort of punky take on the classic Clara Bow bob. She was fond of strange barrettes and had a large collection, shaped like shoes, guitars, guns, and even vegetables. They were both 26, born only 2 hours apart on the same day. They had an almost twin-like affinity that sometimes seemed to border on psychic. They had spent the first 3 days of their Costa Rican honeymoon in bed, leaving only when utterly famished and unable to put off eating for another second. Over dinner in the tiny restaurant at the Perezoso Loco resort where they were staying, Sarah had laughingly said that she was finally putting her foot down, that they had to do something besides have sex, or they might as well have saved the money and stayed back home in Seattle. Before Marty could drag her back to bed, they went up to the desk and registered for the first activity they found, a bird-watching hike through Manuel Antonio National Park. When the alarm had gone off to wake them for the hike, they almost didn't make it out of bed. Sarah had to hit Marty with the pillow and lock herself in the bathroom to get dressed, while he whined at the door like a dog and made bad jokes about battering rams. She clipped her new toucan barrettes into her wild hair, slicked her body with sunscreen and bug repellent, and buttoned her decidedly unsexy shirt all the way up to the neck before she felt safe to let him in. So whether they liked it or not, they were out of the hotel and in the breathtakingly wild jungle they had come to Costa Rica for in the first place. It was incredible, and though Sarah wasn't really much of a bird watcher, she was utterly blown away by the beauty and variety of birds that they saw at every turn. Not to mention the butterflies, lizards, sloths, flowers, and a billion other amazing things. But as time wore on, Marty and Sarah started to lag behind. The other 3 people on the hike, 2 women and a man, seemed serious about the whole thing, writing down every bird they saw and getting tremendously excited about birds that didn't even really look all that interesting to Sarah. Plus, Marty kept doing that thing that made her crazy, sliding his fingers up the groove on the back of her neck into her hair, giving her chills in spite of the heat. The 3 others and the guide, a friendly older Tico named Manuel, like the park, he told them, were enthusing about some sort of tufted whatever further up the path. But Marty had his mouth on the back of her neck, and she turned and kissed him, pressing the length of her body against his. Before she knew it, he had her shirt unbuttoned down to her navel, exposing her small, sensitive breasts, teasing her nipples with his tongue, and making her forget all of Manuel's earnest warnings about poisonous snakes, ants, and spiders. She thought for a moment that they better catch up, that it could be dangerous to be left behind. But having had that good, wise, rational thought, she abandoned herself utterly to the wonderful sensations racing through her body. She slid her hands down under the waistband of Marty's shorts, and he took in a deep breath and let it out softly into her hair. "Baby," Marty said, laughing and pushing her back a few precious inches. "I think someone's coming." Sarah flashed a challenging smile and started to undo the buttons on her cargo pants. "Let 'em watch," she said, sliding her pants and white cotton thong down over her thighs, revealing her bright red pubic hair and pale freckled ass. Marty pulled her close and started kissing her again, gripping her tight with one hand and fumbling to open the fly on his shorts with the other. As he thrust suddenly into her, she tossed her head back and closed her eyes, biting back a cry of pleasure. Head still hanging back, she opened her eyes again and saw an upside-down view of something so odd that for a second she didn't even realize what she was seeing. There was a bloody man standing behind her. He seemed to be wearing a hockey mask. If there was more to that thought, it vanished as a huge blood-stained machete whistled inches past her nose, and then there was nothing but hot, wet redness everywhere, blinding her. Marty's full weight fell forward onto her, knocking her backward into the dirt. She wiped furiously at her eyes, and when she could see again, she screamed. Marty's head was missing, leaving only a clean-sheared stump of neck about an inch from the collar of the expensive, moisture-wicking microfiber shirt which she had bought him especially for the trip. She would have screamed again, but she was silenced by the fall of the machete. Manuel had spotted the darting blue shape of a Malero Lucente ahead and pointed it out to his charges. It took him a second to recall the English name, but by the time it had formed in his mind, one of the women had exclaimed in an excited whisper, "Honey Creeper." "Is that the shining Honey Creeper?" the other woman asked. Manuel nodded. That was it. Shining Honey Creeper. He set up the scope and centered it on the cocky and preening male. The shorter of the two women came over to peer through the scope while the other continued to watch through her binoculars. The man stood back and seemed far more interested in watching the woman's ass as she bent to look into the scope than watching the bird Manuel had pointed out. It had no real difference to Manuel. She was pretty, but it seemed fairly obvious that she and her blonde companions were more than friends. He had been happily married for 21 years. He had more important things to think about than unattainable young girls, like making sure that all his charges were safe and together. Then he looked back down the path and saw that the newlyweds were nowhere to be found. Foolish gringos. He'd told them 100 times to stay close. Smiling indulgently, he thought of what it had been like when he and Elvira were newlyweds. He would not have had much interest in watching birds back then either. Still, they were foreigners and did not understand the jungle like he did. He needed to go back to round them up. A harsh shriek resonated through the trees, and he turned toward the sound, alert and coldly focused. "Was that a monkey?" the man asked. Manuel shook his head. He did not want to scare them, so he tried to keep his voice steady. "Wait here," he said. I'll be back." He ran back down the path toward the noise, but as he rounded the curve, his feet slipped in slick red mud and he staggered sideways, and almost fell on top of his two stray newlyweds. Their heads had been severed cleanly. The man's head lay further down the path, facing mercifully away, as if looking at his own glasses where they lay a few feet beyond. The red-headed girl's head was right beside her body, resting on its crowned, slack, upside-down face and dead, staring eyes pointed right at him. One of her cute toucan hair clips had fallen out and was crushed in the center of a large footprint. Manuel crossed himself and backed away, horrified. He needed to get the others to safety and contact the police right away. This was no animal attack. Manuel had a machete in his own belt, and he immediately recognized this brutal murder as the work of a human animal. He turned to run, planning in his mind how to get his group back to the parking area without passing the bodies of their fellow tourists, when he ran full force into something unyielding. For a split second, he had the crazy notion that a new tree had somehow sprouted in the middle of the path. It was not a tree. It was the devil. The devil looked nothing like Manuel might have imagined, but the cold waves of silent hatred and profound unnatural evil pouring off his huge frame made it clear that his bloody masked creature could be no less than Satan himself. When Manuel was a boy, his mother used to warn him that the devil stalked through the jungle in search of boys who were bad and did not respect their parents. He had ignored her warnings and snuck out with friends to smoke stolen cigarettes and listen to rock and roll music on his best friend's tiny radio. Later, when he started working as a tour guide, he came to know the jungle like his own house, intimately familiar with all its denizens. He knew every danger, from the shy and elusive big cats to the more deadly predators that roam the jungle, but he had never come across his mother's devil. With his mother 15 years in her grave, Manuel realized that she had been horribly right. He spun away from the hateful mask with no other thought than to run, to get away. He forgot his group, forgot about everything in the extremity of his fear. He got no more than 3 steps when the devil reached out and grabbed the strap of Manuel's binoculars. Manuel felt his feet leave the ground and the strap cinched tight around his throat, choking him as the devil wrenched it tighter and tighter, cutting off his air. Red spangles danced around the edges of his vision as he fought for air, clutching helplessly at the strap. "I'm sorry, Mama," he thought. "I'm sorry I was bad." Then the strap broke, and Manuel tumbled down, falling awkwardly forward and head first into an ancient tree. He rapped his head hard against the bark and sagged sideways against the trunk, dazed. A thick, musky odor filled his nostrils, accompanied by loud, agitated clicking, and the fear he felt as he looked into the masked face of the devil. It was nothing compared to what he felt when he realized where he had fallen. Horrible stabs of pain shot through his arm to the shoulder, a fierce, numbing agony filling him. He screamed and pushed himself up and away. It was too late. He had no trouble at all remembering the English name for his attackers, as he was stung again and again, peppered with unbearable agony, like the hot lead spray of a machine gun. Bullet ants. As the tiny predators crawled furiously over his face and arms, blinding him with pain, Manuel jittered and danced in an agonized frenzy. When he felt the devil's bloody machete rip open his belly, emptying him of organs in a single swipe, Manuel was almost grateful. But the pain did not end. Clearly he was in hell, being punished for every sin he'd ever committed. The oblivion of death was cruelly snatched away, replaced instead with the boiling, rabid fury unlike any he had ever known. Bob Henderly decided to go on the bird-watching hike when he saw those two hot dykes sign up the night before. He had spotted them at the pool when he first checked in at the Perezoso Loco. One was dark, leggy, with big tits and a face like that pop slut that did the song about wanting to be your wind-up toy. Wind me up, baby. She was dressed in a smoking hot bikini that left nothing to the imagination, like 3 guitar picks on strings, and looked like she probably had more hands on her than a doorknob. The other girl was blonde and fit with a sleek, athletic build. Not much in the tit department, but a dynamite ass and legs like a marathon runner. She wore little short shorts that snuggled right at the crack of that fabulous ass, and a strapless top that was barely more than that black stripe that blocks the nipples in censored photos. He had been oogling them separately, and when he saw the blonde one give the dark-haired one's ass an affectionate squeeze, while she wrapped a towel around her shoulders, his interest went from mild ogling to serious stalking. He followed them back to their cabina, hoping that maybe catch some girl-on-girl action, but all the windows were covered. He was pretty sure that he could hear little girly noises coming from the back of the cabina. But then he heard his wife Michelle calling him, the suffocating bitch, and he had to go back and pay attention to whatever bullshit problem she had invented to keep everyone focused on her. Bob knew that Michelle would be hungover and did not want to get up to go on a 4-hour hike at 7 in the morning, so he would be free to do his own kind of bird watching. At the beginning of the hike, when they all introduced themselves, Bob learned that the cute one was named Annie and the blonde was named Cheryl. They were from San Francisco. He could have guessed that, and it was obvious that the blonde was the man in their relationship. She barely let the little haughty brunette out of her sight for a second. Not that Bob could blame her. That Annie was clearly trouble and in need of some serious supervision. Even in loose-fitting khakis and a roomy button-down shirt, there was no hiding that saucy bod. It was also obvious that the blonde did not like Bob one bit. She was probably one of those man-hating feminist types. What a waste. Since the guide had left them, the two girls twittered over the image in the scope. They were making notes on their little matching pads. Bob stood back and pretended to be looking up at the canopy through his binoculars. But whenever he could get away with it, he would zoom in on the blonde's camel toe or the brunette's nipples. "Is that an ant strike?" Cheryl asked, swinging the scope to the right and focusing down. "Where?" Annie asked, lifting her binoculars to her eyes and peering up in the direction that her girlfriend had indicated. Bob had focused back in on Annie's nipples when a sudden spray of crimson gushed over the front of her shirt. Bob dropped the binoculars from his eyes and took in a deep breath. A huge machete had neatly bisected Annie's binoculars through the center hinge and embedded itself deep in her face. Blood gushed in a V-shaped spray around the massive blade. The two halves of her binoculars fell on either side of the wound, still attached by the strap. A hulking man in dark, dirty clothes and a gore-splattered hockey mask appeared from between the mossy trunks of 2 giant trees and reached for the machete. Annie staggered back as the blade was pulled free from her face and stumbled on the edge of the trail, falling down over the embankment and disappeared from view. Cheryl screamed Annie's name and threw herself down on the ground on the embankment's edge, reaching down after her girlfriend. Jason lunged towards Cheryl, raising the machete high. As he brought the blade down, Cheryl rolled out of the way so that the machete sank into the dirt, inches from her ear. She grabbed the leg of the tripod that held the scope. "Don't stand there!" Cheryl yelled to Bob, blocking the masked man's machete with the scope. "Help Annie! She's still alive down there! I saw her moving!" The scope broke off the mount and bounced away. Shattered glass sprang across Bob's path. He probably ought to help the cute girl, or better yet, run away, but he was frozen in abject terror, watching in disbelief as the furious blonde swung the tripod at her attacker. Jason countered with the machete, shearing the tripod in half and leaving her holding a single leg. He thrust at her with the blade, aiming for her heart, and she threw herself to the left, jamming the broken end of the tripod leg into her attacker's exposed right side. The masked man grabbed her wrist and wrenched upward, making her let go of the tripod leg. He did not seem at all disturbed by the broken tripod leg sticking out between his ribs. Instead, he swung the machete and chopped off Cheryl's arm. Cheryl screamed and fell back, convulsing on the ground, and the masked man put an enormous boot on the center of her chest, holding her down as he pulled the tripod leg from his side in a dark, unhealthy spurt of noxious fluid. She kicked and struggled, clutching at his pant leg with her one remaining hand. Unfazed, he hefted the tripod leg and sank it into her right eye. The eyeball burst into a gelid gush, and he leaned on the tripod leg, pushing it through her brain, out the back of her skull and deep into the ground beneath her. Her convulsions increased exponentially until her body was arching almost completely off the ground like an electroshock patient. She could not possibly survive a wound like that, but she would not die. She twitched and flailed, and after going still for a handful of seconds, started to get up, making low, wet growling noises in her throat, and scrabbling at the metal pole pinning her head to the dirt. Jason stood watching Cheryl with his head slightly cocked to one side. But when he turned to face Bob, Bob's paralysis broke and he ran. The murderous freak must have been right behind him, but Bob didn't dare look back. He had blundered off the trail and didn't even know what direction he was headed. He didn't care, so long as it was away from that masked maniac. The heat was suffocating and he felt close to passing out. Finally, he staggered to a stop, hands on his knees and gasping for breath. He listened for the sound of pursuit and wondered if he had lost the creep. That was when he became aware of a peculiar smell. It was a musky, vile stench, combined with the butcher's shop undertone. And there was a weird sound, too, a kind of furious clicking. He spun around and saw Manuel, their erstwhile guide. Manuel's eyes were almost popping out of his head, weeping tears of blood. His belly was slashed open, globs of thick yellow fat and glistening organs twisted between his legs. Worse, if anything could be worse than that, he was covered with inch-long dark red and bristly ants. They swarmed over his face and his reaching hands, walking across the bloody surfaces of his huge bloated eyeballs and crawling in and out of his wide, contorted mouth. They lined the gash in his belly, excising neat chunks of his exposed organs with huge mandibles. Bob screamed as Manuel reached out and grabbed his wrist. A horrible white-hot pain rocketed through his arm. He thought for a second that someone had shot him, that there must be police or something. But that thought and every other one was soon swallowed in a tidal wave of the most intense, unimaginable agony that washed away everything else. Chapter 23. When they swam down and reached Val, she had cut the soldier's throat and slashed at his face again and again with her dive knife, but she could not get enough leverage to cut his head off. Blood billowed out into the water, and Alex cringed, fearing contamination. But she had no open wound, so she had to grit her teeth and hope for the best. She was disgusted by how good the warm blood felt in the chilly water. There was really nothing more Val could do but keep the teeth and hands away from her face, and try to stay above the sea of reaching hands below. Stella slammed the infected soldier in the face with her elbow, and when his head rocked back, she let him have it in the forehead with the spear gun. To Alex's amazement, the tip of the spear exploded, blowing the soldier's head into bloody rags. The body spasmed and went down. but the ones below were reaching, jumping, and clutching. One of them got a hold of one of Stella's flippers. She yanked her leg free, losing the flipper in the process, and made the OK sign to Val. Alex thought Val was going to swim away, but she made the OK sign back to Stella. There was a blur of motion to Alex's right. She turned to see Larry struggling with an infected soldier who was trying to climb up his leg like a monkey. Larry drove his dive knife into the soldier's huge swollen eye, and it burst in a cloud of blood. Out of nowhere, something hit the infected soldier like a speeding car, dragging him away. Alex saw the long, sleek body, the powerful tail, with blood trailing through the water behind. It was another shark, this one almost double the size of the first one. She looked back over her shoulder and saw something so awesome and terrifying that it stole her breath and froze her to the bone. Hammerheads. They filled the water all the way up to the surface with their distinctive chubby T-shaped silhouettes, circling in a vortex as they fought over the bodies of the infected soldiers. They had not been there seconds ago, but now they were everywhere, as if they had appeared out of the blue haze like demons called up by some malevolent magic. Alex was filled with a paralyzing terror as one of the huge, magnificent predators headed straight for her, only to turn inexplicably away at the last minute, like some horrible game of chicken. Instead of killing Alex, it dived down and ripped the arm off one of the infected soldiers below, slamming Alex in the ribs with its powerful tail as it passed. The tail was all rock-hard muscle and felt like a blow from an aluminum baseball bat covered in sandpaper. It knocked the wind out of Alex, and she folded up into a clenched C-shape of pain. When she looked up again, someone was fighting furiously against a smaller hammerhead that had locked onto a calf and was shaking it, body lashing back and forth. When the bleeding diver hauled back and punched the shark so hard that one side of its hammer-shaped head snapped like a broken wing, Alex knew it was Butch, and a burst of adrenaline pushed her through the water to his side. She grabbed his wrist and made the OK sign. He looked up at her, eyes wide behind the mask, and made the so-so sign, clutching his bleeding calf. Was he infected? Was the blood in the water too diluted? Was the water too salty? Or was he going to start puking into his regulator and then try to kill her? Alex looked around desperately for Stella, and saw a pair of huge sharks tear into the smaller one with the broken head. There was so much blood and silt and shredded flesh in the water that it was hard to see. Shark blood, Butch's blood, and the infected blood too. She could barely read her air gauge, holding it right up to her mask. She had 12 minutes of air left. Butch only had 10. She held tight to Butch's hand and wondered if he could turn psychotic on her before they could be eaten or ran out of air. Or maybe one of the sharks would carry Stella too far away, and their heads would explode. When Stella grabbed Alex's shoulder, the woman's grip was so fierce Alex thought she had been bitten. She turned with a startled gasp and almost lost her regulator. When she saw Stella, the relief that washed over her made her feel sick. Stella had only one flipper and pointed urgently to the left and gestured for them to follow her. Alex could see two other divers right behind her, but couldn't tell who they were. One of them was leaking swirls of blood from their right side, but acted normal. When Alex looked down, she saw the third diver. Whoever it was had got too low and was being savaged by the infected soldiers on the bottom. There was a wild spiral of bubbles as the loose regulator spun around and around on the end of its hose. Alex swam, concentrating on nothing, but pushing through the water as fast as she could. Then there was a slight rise in the seafloor, and the bottom dropped away into darkness. Vertiginously, she stopped and reached out to grab Stella like a superstitious pagan, nearly overwhelmed with the profoundly primitive fear of the abyss beneath. Behind them was the churning hell of blood and death, and ahead, terrifyingly endless blue. Stella gave Alex the stern OK sign again, and Alex forced her shaking hand to make it back. Swimming in mid-water was like flying through hazy blue nothingness, occasionally broken by flashes of shimmering silver as they passed through schools of fish. Alex sometimes thought she could make out dark shapes below, but she had no idea if they were rocks or something that wanted to eat her. She was starting to feel a cold, dizzy sensation of overwhelming sleepiness. Her body was shivering. She wanted to give up, close her eyes, and drift down into the nothingness, and let it fill her. Stella was pointing again, and when Alex saw something enormous coming toward them out of the haze like a city bus with a yawning black maw, her first emotion wasn't fear or wonder. It was a kind of tired resignation. At least, if she was eaten, she would stop shivering. The massive new creature did not attack them. It didn't even divert its course to move away from them. It swam right under them, its huge spotted bulk passing less than a foot beneath. Alex could have reached down and touched it, but instead she looked at her air gauge. 9 minutes. Would it be enough? Stella was pointing again, pointing to something up on the surface. Alex realized it was the bottom of a small boat. There was a long rope hanging down beneath it with orange plastic discs at even intervals, and Stella was making for the rope with a renewed burst of speed. Alex followed, weary and relieved. When they all reached the rope, Stella made the up sign again, followed by 3 flashes of her palm. Alex had never been so happy to see someone point upwards in her life. She filled her vest and headed up. Nearly halfway to the surface, Stella grabbed her wrist and yanked her to a stop. Stella put Alex's hand on the rope and clenched her fist, then made a stop sign, palm out, like a cop directing traffic. Why the hell were they stopping? Alex looked at her air gauge. Only 8 minutes left. Stella hung there like Butch wasn't bleeding, like they had plenty of time to relax and enjoy the scenery. Was he infected? The other diver, who was also bleeding, did not seem upset or panicked by the inexplicable weight. He did not seem infected either. She could see now that it was Tig. He held the rope with one hand and his bleeding side with the other, eyes calm. Alex looked at her air again. 4 minutes. Should she make the throat-cutting running out of air sign that Stella had showed them? What about Butch? He had less oxygen than she did, and he was gripping her arm way too tightly, pale and terrified. She was about to poke Stella and show her Butch's nearly empty air gauge, when for no reason Alex could determine, Stella, Tig, and Val started to ascend again. Stella waved for Alex and Butch to follow. Alex broke the surface and spat out her regulator, sucking in a deep, delicious breath of real warm tropical air. She pushed the mask up onto her forehead. The sun felt so good on her chilly face. The sky was a gorgeous, flawless blue, with tall white clouds stacked up on the distant horizon. She could not believe that she was still alive. Alex pushed Butch ahead of her, and then climbed up the ladder onto the bobbing boat. The small, nondescript fishing boat was empty, seemingly abandoned with nothing but a small smear of blood on the railing toward the front. Alex looked back toward the smoking ring of military ships, and saw chunks of bobbing flotsam crawling with infected soldiers and small floating clusters of people, maybe the ones that weren't weighted down with equipment. She wondered if they could doggy paddle their way to the boat. At least one of them had obviously been here before them. Butch staggered into Alex and sat down hard on his ass, clutching his calf. Alex crouched beside him, peeled off her vest and her empty tank, and then helped him do the same. He was white, his teeth chattering, but he did not seem infected. Stella appeared with silvery thermal blankets and wrapped them around Butch. She offered Butch a thin metal flask, but he shook his head vehemently. Stella shrugged and took a swig herself. "Can you suture?" Stella asked Alex as she squatted down and peeled up the leg of Butch's suit to examine the nasty ring of punctures. Alex frowned and shook her head. "Val?" Stella called over her shoulder. "You bet I can," Val said. Stella handed Val a first aid kit and rushed over to help Tig, who was able to stand and was pulling off his suit by himself, revealing a gory circle of teeth marks that ran from below his nipple to his hip bone. He, too, seemed utterly normal, hurt but not infected. "Elevate his feet," Val told Alex, handing her a wadded-up towel. "And try to get him out of this wet suit." Val cut into the neoprene suit, slashing the legs all the way up to his hips. Butch was able to wrestle his arms out and pull the wet Camp Isla Negra t-shirt off before collapsing back from exhaustion. Alex took the shirt and flung it off the edge of the boat like a contaminated thing. "Shorts too, sunshine," Val said. "This is no time for modesty. We need to get him warm and dry right away before I start sewing." "Right," Alex said. "No problem," Butch said through clenched teeth. "Keep in mind that I just got out of the cold water, okay?" Alex laughed, and even Val smiled. Butch laughed a little too, but Alex could see how much pain he was in as she undid the shorts and pulled them carefully past his wounds. She couldn't help but think of the last time she had pulled off his shorts and felt a thick blush creeping up her cheeks. She wrapped a thermal blanket tight around his body when Butch clutched her hands. "Stay," he said. "Please." Alex narrowed her eyes and then sat back down on the deck beside him, holding his hand in both of hers. "Okay," Val said, opening a white sterile packet and pulling out a wicked-looking curved needle with a tail of black thread. "Here we go. Hold as still as you can, boy." "Fuck," Butch said as Val poked the curved needle first into one meaty lip of the deepest puncture and then the other, pulling the two sides together in a tight knot. Alex had to look away, queasy and light-headed. Instead, she looked at Butch, who was looking right back at her. "Why am I okay?" he asked. "Because you're a tough motherfucker," Alex replied. "I mean, why am I?" Butch clenched his teeth and grunted as Val pulled another knot tight. "Ugh, why am I not trying to eat your face right now?" He paused again. "Jesus, fuck, that hurts." I don't know," Alex said. "Maybe the water was too cold or too salty for the virus to survive. I have no idea." "When I felt that, ugh!" Again, a teeth-gritting pause and a grunt. "That fucker latched onto me. I wasn't thinking, oh shit, I'm gonna get eaten. I thought, fuck, I'm infected." Alex nodded as he squeezed her hand painfully tight. "I saw you there beside me," he grunted again and then looked up at her. "And I was afraid I was going to hurt you." Alex had no idea what to say to that, so she kept holding his hands. "I wasn't afraid of dying," he continued. "I was afraid of hurting you." "Well, ain't that sweet," Val said. "Why don't you sit on his face or something and keep him still? Only 97 more of these bad boys left to go." Alex blushed again. She wanted to say something back, something to express the way she had felt when she saw him bitten, the way her heart felt bitten too, but she couldn't make the words come out. Okay, this has been chapters 21, 22, and 23 of Friday the 13th, The Jason Strain. And yes, I used the Jaws theme during the shark scene, sue me. Anyways, I've been narrating this book, and this book is a roller coaster of a book. Krista Foss did a good job, and I'm being honest with you, even if Jason was not in this book at all, and it was just some other thing that caused this virus to outbreak, I would still enjoy this book. Maybe what made me so mad back in the day, back in 2005 when I read it, was that Jason wasn't in it much, but as I'm older now and I appreciate literature more, I'm really enjoying the plot and story. I remembered it being a lot about the reality show, but really the reality show has only been like a tenth of this book. So I'm really digging it so far. Val is a smug bitch, in my opinion, and I can't wait till she gets hers. But, I really am rooting for Butch, and I'm rooting for Alex. Alright guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's narration, what you think of the story so far. We've only got 6 chapters to go, so we're getting close to the conclusion here, folks. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, have a great night, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of Friday the 13th, The Jason Strain.